Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Ensuring newborn calves consume colostrum is one of the most important management strategies cow-calf operations can implement to promote healthy calves. Colostrum provides essential antibodies to a calf with virtually no immune system. Colostrum also contains fats, vitamins, proteins, and other immune cells essential to provide the calf energy, warmth, and the local immunity it requires to thrive in the first few days of life. It is crucial for producers to observe newborn calves to make sure they have received colostrum and to intervene if necessary. Learn more about handling colostrum by clicking the link in the show notes. This episode is titled Calf Health Management Practices, What Does the Science Say? And features the BCRC Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the January 2026 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine, and it's been reposted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. And today, we're going to talk about calf health management practices and what the science says. So sometimes two different research studies will ask the same question, but get different results. And that doesn't mean that one is right and the other is wrong, or that science is a coin toss, or that research is pointless. It just means that details and context are important. So if we want to know whether a particular management practice helps prevent scours in beef calves, a large-scale study that measures signs of scours and treatment rates and recovery rates in beef calves in a real-life production environment are a lot more helpful than small studies that compare rectal temperatures or white blood cell numbers in a few individually housed dairy calves. And so this is where something called a systematic review is helpful. What a systematic review does is it clearly defines what kind of existing studies will help answer a specific question. And then it goes through all of the available published studies that meet those criteria, and it reviews them and then identifies what they all agree on. And systematic reviews like this are really helpful when trying to make recommendations to real-life producers. And so Claire Windier of Acer Consulting and a team of veterinarian researchers from the University of Calgary and the University of Saskatchewan Vet School, they recently published a systematic review of management practices related to pre-weaning death loss in beef calves. Then they convened a panel of 12 veterinarians to identify and prioritize a large variety of management practices that would provide the greatest benefit for the most cow-calf producers. And both of those research papers are linked in the online version of this post if you want to look those up. So how did they do this? Well, first, they screened nearly 5,000 published research studies looking at pre-weaning death loss. Then they eliminated the ones that weren't about beef calves, and they eliminated the ones that only used small numbers of animals, and the ones that deliberately infected calves with specific bugs instead of using natural exposure, and they eliminated the ones that didn't measure actual health outcomes and so on. And they were really strict about this. And of the 5,000 studies they started with, there were only 11 that met their criteria. Of the 5,000 studies they started with, there were only 11 that met their criteria to provide meaningful information regarding pre-weaning death loss in beef calves. It doesn't mean the other 4,900 and some studies were a waste of time and money. They may have been perfectly well designed to effectively answer the specific question they were asking, something like whether two different experimental vaccine formulations produce similar immune responses against a specific pathogen in newborn calves. That's important to know in the early stages of vaccine development. It just wasn't particularly helpful for this specific producer level question. So what did these 11 studies all agree on? Well, they found that there are 4 management practices that clearly impact pre-weaning calf mortality. and they'll sound pretty familiar to you. First, providing colostrum to calves that need assistance at calving or hadn't nursed on their own reduces pre-weaning mortality. Calves that need help being born or need help nursing they're still at a higher risk of dying before weaning compared to calves that don't need any help. But providing those compromised calves with high quality colostrum shortly after birth greatly increases the likelihood that they'll survive. Second, injecting selenium and vitamin E at birth reduced calf mortality. The Cow-Calf Surveillance Network confirmed that many cows across Canada have less than adequate selenium, and vitamin E levels decline as forages get stored or weathered. And these selenium and vitamin E deficiencies can cause white muscle disease in newborn calves. So you can supplement the cows through the feed, and that helps the cow, but it doesn't necessarily transfer enough mineral or vitamin to the fetal or newborn calf fast enough. So that's why those injections are important. And injecting newborn calves is a really easy way to rapidly prevent a common problem. The third thing was calving season. Spring or summer calving herds lost fewer calves before weaning than fall or winter calving herds. And of course, low temperatures and wind make small, wet calves feel even colder. And cold calves have a slower metabolic rate. They're less vigorous and they nurse more slowly, or they're slower to get up to nurse. And if this means that they don't consume enough colostrum soon enough, they'll receive less immune protection from the cow and they will be more likely to get sick and die before weaning. On the other hand, a calving barn can protect newborn calves from the cold, but it also bunches calves together, and that increases the risk of disease transmission and sickness and death. So that, of course, can pose a conundrum for purebred breeders who like to calve early in order to produce bulls that are mature enough to breed as yearlings. Finally, the length of the calving season is important. Herds with a shorter calving season had less pre-weaning death loss. Calving grounds should be relatively free of disease-causing microbes at the start of the calving season, so calves that are born early are exposed to less disease. Then the disease builds up as more and more cows calve, and as the earliest born calves start to shed their own pathogens and add to the disease load. So as a result, calves born later in the calving season are exposed to more disease. So when there's a tight calving season, the last calf is on the ground before the disease machine really cranks into high gear. Now, the veterinary experts all agreed that providing colostrum to calves that have not nursed and administering clostridial vaccines to pre-weaned calves will help reduce pre-weaning mortality in all herds. There were a lot of other recommended management practices, including specific vaccination and biosecurity and nutritional and calving management practices that were deemed to be very useful for most or some herds. That doesn't mean they're optional, it means they're situational. They might not provide much benefit for some operations, but they might greatly reduce pre-weaning mortality on other operations. There were a few other practices like preventive or group antibiotic treatment under the direction of a veterinarian that might be potentially helpful in rare cases. But antibiotics simply aren't effective for some diseases or pathogens. So the veterinary direction part is really important to make sure that you're not simply wasting money on ineffective drugs and at the same time delaying effective treatment and risking the death of a really valuable calf. So what does this all mean to you? Well, if you haven't already, now is a really good time to touch base with your veterinarian to review your calving management practices and refresh yourself on Calf 911. What do you do when there's problems? There are some really great Canadian resources at beefresearch.ca that were developed through the checkoff you pay. The bottom line is that giving calves a good start in life will greatly increase the odds that they'll survive till weaning. And at these prices, can you afford not to? So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.